Hello, everyone, and welcome to this 88th episode of the IWFM webinar series. I don't know where time's going. We're nearly on three figures in terms of the series of the webinar, but thank you for joining us today. And you've got the title of today's webinar on screen. It's Navigating a Changing Energy Landscape in the Transition to Net Zero. And this is supported with our partner, Bryt Energy, which we have a couple of colleagues from Bryt Energy on the panel today, making up a stellar panel, which we'll go through today. Really, the challenge we've got is balancing the challenges posed by a volatile energy market, as we've all experienced in the media, are playing out, is really continued need for the decarbonisation. And this hasn't been has not been easy for businesses this year, and will probably continue throughout 2023, I'm afraid. But with increased customer demand for sustainability alongside net zero targets driving government policy, carbon reduction remains essential, but it's difficult to understand how best to tackle it, where to start, and what technologies to choose. So today's webinar, we're going to tackle some of those areas in the short hour we've got, so enough from me to get through, but in terms of a lot to go through, I should say. But really, we're going to tackle things around better data for better energy strategy. So how does that work? A holistic approach for long-term success, which is key, tying in what I've just said, and behaviours leading to change and creating a golden thread of information. So who's going to support me on answering that? That's going to be with you guys. We have got some polls on today's episode, as well as a Q&A section dedicated. So please send your questions through to the panelists. So I mentioned the panelists. Who are they? So if we just move on to the next slide. There are our lovely panelists on this 88th episode. Firstly, I'm Peter Brogan, Head of Research and Insight at the IWFM. Sadly, this is going to be my last episode as I am leaving the Institute, so let's make it a good one. No pressure on the panelists, but only as good as the questions that come in from you guys. So we'd encourage you to send the Q&A in. But let's hear from others on the call today in terms of the webinar. So I want to start off with Atia Khan, Head of Sustainability Advisory, Operations Performance Sustainability, RSS. So good afternoon, Atia. If you could introduce yourself to the panelists, to the audience, I should say, that'd be great.
Afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation, Peter. It's always a pleasure to come to these events with the IWFM. So yes, I'm Atia Khan. I work with ISS. I'm head of advisory services, which is our consultancy services around sustainability. And I specialise in net zero, biodiversity and circularity. I've been in the FM industry for approximately 16 years. So yeah, really passionate about our industry and sustainability. Thank you, Peter.
No, thank you, Atia. And you've shown the others how it should be done in terms of the introduction. So no pressure, Sandeep. It's always difficult to go first. But next, as you see on your screens there, Sandeep Nair for Energy Management, BAM Energy. So good afternoon, Sandeep.
Good afternoon, Peter. Thank you for inviting me. Good afternoon, all. Thanks for joining. I'm Sandeep Nair. I work for Energy Services Division of Royal BAM Group. I've been in the energy management industry for 15 years now, carrying out end-to-end decarbonization projects. And I've never seen such a buoyant industry right now as it's been in the last 2 years. So it's a great space to be and a lot of work to be done. Thank you.
No, thank you, Sandeep. And I mentioned Bryt Energy, and you can see two colleagues kindly from Bryt Energy on today's panel and today's webinar. So I'll go next to David Taylor, Sales and Marketing Director at Bryt Energy.
Good afternoon, all. Nice to speak to you. I think the current job title says it all. I've been in the electricity industry for around 25 years, primarily in customer-facing roles, so very much working with customers to understand what they're looking for from their electricity supply. The last 20 years or so have been mainly focused around renewables. So either working with renewable generators to help them get contracts in place to sell their energy into the market, or working with end users to understand how they can purchase renewables, and increasingly how they can understand their kind of sustainable journey as they all focus on how do they get to net zero and much lower carbon emissions.
No, thank you, David. And last but not least, as you see on your screens there, Ben Tutt, Business Development Manager at Bryt Energy. So good afternoon, Ben.
Afternoon. Thanks very much, Peter. Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Tutt. I have been in the industry now think about 8 years, always in industrial, commercial, those are customer-facing roles. At the moment, predominantly I'm responsible for speaking to new business customers, developing supply solutions that are relevant to the current market, which is constantly changing. So there's a lot of understanding what customers are doing, what their aspirations are, educating on market conditions, and then developing appropriate solutions.
No, thank you, Ben. So our audience, now you've got to know the panelists. That's great. So thank you. We'll hear a little bit shortly from Ben, just to do a quick introduction to who Bryt Energy are, our supportive partner on today's webinar, I should say, but also supported us, sort of, we move to the next slide, on our recent launched thought leadership piece around this topic, which really today's webinar is building on. So would encourage members, non-members to download that. We've also got a Q&R code for you to download. And at this point, I will hand over to Ben just to go, as promised, just a quick introduction to Bryt Energy and who you are. So, but would encourage the audience to look at that document, as is very thought-provoking, as well as it's got some checklists and key questions to ask yourself in terms of your transition to net zero. At this point, I encourage the audience then to send questions in as we go through. But as promised, enough from me. I'll hand over to Ben just to go through a short introduction to Bryt, and we really get into the content on today's webinar. So speak to you shortly, but Ben, the floor's yours.
Thank you very much. Lucy, can I have that? Oh, there it is. Perfect. So a quick introduction to Bryt Energy, who we are, what we do, and a look at where we see the future of the sustainable energy system in the UK. So Bryt Energy, our principal activity is the supply of zero carbon renewable electricity to businesses in Britain. But as a organisation that's led by a purpose, we try and be more than what it is we just do. So we've got a great team here who have a wealth of experience, and we try and use those skills and expertise to deliver on our purpose. So driving positive changes, making an impact across communities, as well as ultimately across the planet. We've only ever supplied power from solar, wind, and hydro generation. So we've got a sustainable product that we've tried to mirror by being a truly sustainable business. In the last few years, we've committed to setting science-based targets. We hold ourselves accountable to our chosen sustainability development goals, and our sustainable values really at the core of our business. Most of that comes from our parent company. So we're part of the Statkraft Group, who are Europe's largest renewable power generators. And over the last, I think it's coming up to about 10 years now, they've invested about £1.3 billion in the UK renewable electricity system. And the primary aim is to support National Grid's target to deliver a zero carbon electricity system by 2035. In the UK, electricity or energy supply is one of our biggest single sources of emissions. So in 2021, the energy supply sector contributed over 23% of our overall carbon emissions. And as a supplier within that mix, we play a key role in driving the renewable energy transition. But because we're part of a complex grid involving consumers at one end, generators at the other, with networks in between and all different contracting mechanisms, we can't do this in silo. So last year we set out our vision for where we see the energy sector going, and that's a net zero future in which consumers are empowered to actively engage with, support, and ultimately benefit from a sustainable energy system. And we're using our influence to try and help customers use electricity more intelligently, more sustainably, ultimately supporting the energy system and achieving net zero. Now we'll come on to obviously the future of the energy market and where we see things going, but I think it's important to address the current market conditions. The fact is that over the past year, businesses have faced a variety of challenges. These are from day-to-day operational challenges, but looking at rising energy costs, reviewing historic procurement strategies that may no longer be fit for purpose. We've got an increased level of volatility, which increases the cost of risk and the impact of that risk on businesses. The result is that energy is being focused on much more keenly than it has probably been in recent years. And the challenges that has put forward has inevitably meant that we have seen some companies start to draw focus away from sustainability, and it's completely understandable. You know, many businesses are struggling to balance long and short-term priorities. But from our view, this really isn't a time to let sustainability plans stall. So with the energy market in such a turbulent place, and with so many questions still to answer around how we're going to navigate through this energy crisis, our belief is that focusing on our purpose, focusing on that sustainability, is more important than ever. The good news behind that is that we believe that lasting sustainability can be more easily achieved if the climate crisis and the energy crisis are tackled together. And this month we've seen further evidence of that all the way up at government level. So we've got the creation of the new Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. So we're now DESNS, which is slightly more difficult to say than BEIS, but it's good to see government taking account for net zero along with energy security within the same group. So the question is obviously, where do we see the role of businesses in this sustainable future, and what businesses beyond simply negating the impacts of climate change, what benefits are you likely to see? If I can get the next slide, please. So currently, we've got an energy system that is powered by large-scale, non-renewable, carbon-emitting, but ultimately dispatchable generation. And as we move forward into the National Grid's 2035 target and further into government's 2050 net zero target, we're going to see a future powered more by sustainable technologies. Predominantly, we're talking about wind and solar in the UK. And what that means is we're going to see more variability in near-term power prices as generators become less dispatchable and much more dependent on weather conditions. We've already started to see some of these changes even before last year, but if we take last year as an example, as we tried to move away from gas imports, we saw an increase in the difference between the highest and lowest prices on the near-term day-ahead market. And when we're talking about the near-term prices, what we're really looking at is the energy system's primary way of communicating what is required. So when there are restrictions due to a high demand for heat at night, when there's very little solar, we're going to see higher prices. But likewise, if there's an excess on the grid, if it's a relatively cool day in summer when there's not much of a need for air conditioning, but there's a huge amount of solar on the grid, we've started to see prices move to negative during those times. If I can get the next slide, please. Perfect. So along with an increase in volatility, we're also going to see an increase in demand, and that's predominantly coming from the electrification of transport through EVs and moving away from traditional mechanisms for generating heat and electrifying that requirement for energy. So that increase in demand is going to come with its own challenges, but alongside it, we're going to see the emergence of smarter technology that's going to work better in harmony with an energy system. And that really presents the opportunity for businesses to manage their costs while supporting the grid. So if you have a look on the graph on the right, this is from National Grid ESO's 2022 Future Energy Scenario. What it shows is a level of flexibility on the grid that they can call on effectively to help balance near-term demand. So at the moment, we've got about 60 gigawatts of flexibility, which is predominantly driven from gas and coal generation. In the future energy scenario, the National Grid that believes by about 2035, we're going to need to double that flexibility, but also we're going to need to remove the existing carbon-heavy technology. Businesses with a really clear energy strategy who can get a holistic view of their operations and energy assets, and with the right structures and controls in place, are going to have a real opportunity to benefit in this area, to remove costs while supporting the transition. So by tackling energy strategy with a long-term approach, reviewing data, businesses can meet short-term challenges, but also future-proof their energy management and assisting with decarbonisation. Ultimately, we are going to have to start to change how we think about the grid. Up until now, it's been something that is just there for us to use whenever we want, but ultimately it's going to be a shared resource where businesses are going to have to be able to use what they need, give back what they don't, and really treat it as a shared resource between everyone. Ultimately, this is going to help our customers or good grid citizens move into a net zero system. And that's everything from me. I'll pass back to you, Peter.
Thanks, Ben. And I think that was great as an introduction to Bryt, but also some of the need for, as you said, the title on your slide there, the resilience of a more resilient energy system and some of the challenges that brings. So I'm already pleased that the audience have been listening to me, which is always key, as well as Ben and others in terms of sending questions through. So we're already getting questions through, guys, which is great. And I will come to them in a dedicated section later. But a lot hearing from in terms of what we've heard to date from Ben and within the report I referenced earlier about the challenges. So I'm going to open up to the floor, and as a pure gentleman I am, Attia, and you're probably going to virtually kick me for this, I'm going to go to you first. And I'm going to ask, what are the immediate challenges for implementing an energy strategy that businesses are facing right now? And I appreciate, as one of the big service providers, along with BAM, I hasten to add Sandeep, who we'll hear from later, you deal with many clients at different levels. What are those challenges? And I guess how is the juggernaut of ISS facing up to these?
Oh, so yeah, there's a lot of challenges, but what I would like to say is everyone's hearts are in the right places. So a lot of our customers, they know that they need to reduce their energy demand. They know it now makes sense to do that because the business cases are, giving us better return on investment, for example, by investing in renewables and getting your net zero pathways completed for your estate, for example, gives you a really clear structure in terms of what you need to do by when. So I think the hearts are in the right places. The challenges I'd just like to touch on, because it's like this specific area is something that's so personal to me and I keep coming across. So I just wanted to raise this one that is around skills and competency hugely. So though our customers have their hearts and minds sometimes in the right place, and certain organizations do, what tends to happen is they would want to recruit an energy lead or an energy specialist or a sustainability or net zero specialist. But that individual, because it usually is one person, because we're amazing, doesn't tend to have the right interactions within the organization. So you end up being a bit of a lone wolf. So I think that's like a huge challenge in terms of career pathways for energy specialists, because you do tend to be working alone and kind of like driving change as an individual in an organization. And that can be challenging as well for people. But yeah, I just wanted to raise that, as I feel that that's one of the main issues that I've been coming across over the last few weeks is, and we also have a challenge of one individual doesn't always have the full skill sets needed to get an organization to net zero. And so it tends to be under-resourced. And yeah, priorities tend to be overseen as well because there's no clear program. So yeah, quite a bit there, Peter. But yeah, that's what I feel.
No, definitely. No, I'm glad you. In some ways, I'm glad you brought up skills. But then there's a part of me that I'm glad you haven't. And I mean that politely, because I think there is a poll later. Spoiler alert, folks. We do cover aspect of skills. So that's important to resonate, and that the hearts and minds are there, but not necessarily. There might be maybe an upskilling need, I'll put it politely, but let's see more from the audience. Sandeep, I'll come to you next. Obviously, you've heard from Attia there at ISS, and obviously BAM, and you obviously were involved in our round table discussion. Same question to you, dear self. What are you seeing amongst your client and businesses in terms of the challenges?
For what I've seen is for businesses, the key challenges is three, I would say. Capital, the lack of capital, and where there's a heavy reliance on funding from the government to actually do decarbonization. Secondly, I would say is adoption of new technology, how you adapt to your existing retrofitting into your existing portfolio. So that's again a challenge. And the third is what Attia just mentioned, is about the skills gap. There aren't enough heat pump installers, there aren't enough solar PV designers compared to the gas engineers that we have, the pool of gas engineers. So it's actually the upskilling. So these are the three key challenges I believe that the businesses are facing and which needs to be addressed pretty soon.
No, thank you. And it's almost like the advancement of technology overriding the skills out there, which is a point. David, we heard from your colleague Ben, I guess from a Bryt perspective, as in the company, whether it's a Bryt perspective in terms of the other word, Bryt might be, I'll wait for your answer. But in terms of what are the challenges, well, Ben touched upon it in obviously his intro, but is there anything to add on what Atia and Sandeep have said there? Are you seeing similar challenges across your clients?
Yeah, I think probably one of the biggest things that we see from a customer perspective at the minute is much more involvement in the energy space across the business. So you've often got very different competing needs. I guess a few years ago, putting in place your supply contract for your electricity was a relatively straightforward process. It would typically be managed by procurement and/or finance, would largely be around understanding the costs for the coming year. Whereas even now, as we're talking, obviously, the sustainability piece plays hugely into the purchasing decision. Some of that volatility in pricing that we've seen means that trying to understand and budget and get a very good handle on what you're using and when has become absolutely critical. So you've got kind of all sorts of people being brought into that conversation. And I think one of the things that we potentially see being a big challenge for businesses is that then there's not a very joined up approach. Everybody has their own view of the business energy needs. It's just making sure that that is all brought together, aligned, and that there's a really good plan in place to take that forward.
No, that's great. And Ben, just to bring you in there in terms of the challenges, and I appreciate you touched upon them in your intro, as I mentioned, is it safe to say that businesses are in more control than ever when it comes to their energy?
That's a really good question. There is the opportunity for businesses to be in more control, absolutely. But, and to bring back something that David mentioned, one of the biggest challenges that we are seeing is how businesses can coordinate a centralized response. When you've got so many different people getting involved with different priorities, in theory, the control is there, but actually being able to coordinate that into a holistic strategy is probably the biggest challenge that I see.
And that's a perfect cue for our first poll, folks. So you got the gist of today's webinar. So Lucy, behind the scenes, Lucy's our technical support. So when we're referring to Lucy, she's the kind person that's setting the polls up as well as launching them for us. So tying of that last point Ben's just raised there, we've got a poll here and I encourage you to participate. It is anonymous, so we're not going to name and shame, but it's important to know. Do you have an energy strategy within your organization? Yes, no, don't know. Just tying in with some points around the control and aspects of skills that's mentioned. We've got a poll later on that. But in terms of an energy strategy within your organization, do you have one, you don't have one, or you simply don't know? So I'll just give you a couple seconds to complete that and then we can move on to the next question. But I'm fully aware we are getting questions through, guys. So I will try and get to audience questions as soon as I can. So if we can close the poll, let's see the audience today. We've got a good group on there. So we got 59% saying yes, over a quarter of today's audience saying no, and 13% saying don't know. So I guess a bit unfair to the panel, but I'm going to do it, and you can virtually kick me again. There is a second kick allowed. In terms of that, is that surprising on the results? Does that resonate? I know it's a short poll. You could go into the numbers today, but 59% of the audience today, and we've got quite a substantial audience on today's live episode, indicating they have one. But more importantly, the knows and don't knows. Does that sound familiar to clients or your experience with clients? Does that resonate?
Yeah,
it actually does.
So Sandeep, you're saying yes, it does. Yeah,
It does. It's because of a lack of data and also the need to actually have those scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions, and then to create that strategy to get to net zero. So yes, I wasn't surprised.
No, so that building on that, and you've tied in nicely, and I've probably jumped ahead in the questions, so blame the host here, Sandeep, and I go around to the other panelists as well. What are the immediate challenges for implementing an energy strategy that businesses are facing right now? So rather than pick on those individuals that will remain anonymous, we're not going to name them today, but for the audience there that there's quite a substantial that say don't know. What are the barriers? What are the challenges stopping people implementing an energy strategy? And you've just touched upon some of that in your answer, but appreciate if there's anything else you want to expand upon.
I think the key things is like it's lack of good data available, and hence the lack of understanding of your baseline, and also the need to actually engage with an expert to set that strategy, how to actually get to net zero, what are the steps that needs to be taken. So it's an early engagement that needs to happen. And if businesses want to get to net zero to 2030, 2050, and also if they're going to align it to SBTi standards, then they need to do it pretty soon.
No, that's great. And I'll bring you in, Atia, in terms of that. Just to repeat the question, what are the immediate challenges for implementing an energy strategy that businesses are facing right now? So just to allude to that poll again, there is a majority of our audience that are saying no, don't know. How could we support that? Maybe we can highlight what the issues are, and maybe we can come on later how possibly we overcome them. But from your experience, what are the challenges?
Yeah, exactly like what Sandeep has said. It's about data. So big challenges we have is around energy performance in buildings. Like if we don't have the sub-metered information and data, it's really difficult to know what part of the building is underperforming or overperforming, or is this a behavioral issue? Is this people bringing their own assets, electrical assets, portable assets into the buildings? You just don't have that level of information. So yeah, data is key. And this is where the challenge sits, and it touches on what Sandeep, I think, mentioned earlier as well around capital, because getting sub-metering in buildings is not a cheap challenge. It can be really, really quite expensive. So we're talking, almost £1 million onwards for some of our portfolio, definitely. And that becomes a very difficult thing to balance against in terms of like your return on investments, if there is one. But we do need access to the data. The other bit I'd like to mention as well is around getting your net zero pathway completed. So that tends to be the priority. And if we ask the question, for example, how many organizations have set a net zero target, I will be surprised if 13% of people said they didn't know. So I imagine everyone who is anybody has set a commitment around net zero at this point in time. But it kind of like sits back on, unfortunately, that piece I was mentioning around competency and understanding within the organizations, having the in-house skills as well, because a lot of organizations have set net zero targets, but in terms of their actual trajectory in their program in order to achieve their actual net zero ambitions, that's the bit where we're on a slight back foot with organizations. And I think the energy strategy sits under that. And that's the challenge, is that it really is stage 2, and you need to get the experts in basically to give you a hand developing an energy strategy in a building.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a need as an opportunity there as well. Ben, David, I bring you in jointly on this. Obviously, you've heard the poll, you heard responses from Sandeep and Atia, and there's some questions coming from the audience that we get through later that's tackling some of this. Does a lot of what Sandeep and Atia resonate? Is that what you're seeing? Data, skills, lack of understanding is what are you seeing as the challenges?
Yeah, I think a lot of that does resonate. I think the other big thing, kind of aside from what Atia and Sandeep have said, is something that Ben mentioned in his introduction, which is certainly over the last 6 to 12 months, there's been a real the market's been turned on its head, and customers have been facing very high prices, very volatile prices, huge amounts of uncertainty, and it's no surprise in certain quarters that's almost led to a sense of paralysis. The immediate short-term challenges for a lot of people were, how do we get through the winter? The idea of looking any further beyond there, for a lot of people, probably felt fairly unimaginable at that point. But I think, like Ben said, what we are starting to hear is, and in some sense, the number in that poll is encouraging, almost 60% of people with an energy strategy in place, is that those short-term issues, tackling the climate crisis alongside the energy crisis, is really key for customers to start really thinking through. And it's about thinking ahead. It's not just about the here and now. It's about, what does your business look like from an energy perspective going forward? How do you replace those, I guess, particularly heat and transport, as Ben mentioned, which are typically fossil fuel driven? We're starting to see a much bigger uptake, certainly a lot more interested in low carbon alternatives. But that very much changes the shape of the business, certainly from an electricity perspective. So it's really starting to think ahead and get that kind of vision embedded into the business, I think.
Thanks, David. And Ben, from your perspective, adding to what you've heard, I guess how does an organisation balance this between the short-term challenges and the long-term sustainability and energy strategy for those? So obviously there are short-term challenges, and some of that's out of people's control because of other market forces, which we won't go in today, but obviously we're aware of those. How do you get that balance? I think that's a difficult question to answer, because I don't think anyone's mastered it, or have they?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I would say on that is that although getting the solution right is very difficult, looking at both of the challenges have the same answer. Both Sandeep and Atia have both commented on it, but it's data. And it's interesting because we've been saying this I was trying to think back while we're talking it through, and we've been saying for years and years, you need to understand, what are you using, where are you using, why are you using, what's it for, getting that real granular level. It's not an easy task by any means, but that's always going to be the first step. From there, it's then bringing the company along with you on that journey as well. So once you've got the data, you then have to put it forward and say, okay, well, what does this mean? Bringing different groups of the organization together. You may well have a variety of assets for over the years that have been put in by various short-term projects. You may have solar on your roof, you might have a CHP stuck somewhere, you may even have a long-term power purchase agreement contract in place. And it's just working out how all of these different mechanisms are going to interact with each other and what's going to be the impact. So I think that's probably, it is just understanding what it is you're doing as an organization. It sounds like a very easy thing to do, but we keep on hearing it as being an issue.
No, great. And all four of you, that you had a commonality in all your responses was the word data. So that's right on cue again, Ben. Thank you for that in terms of our next poll. So if we go to our next poll, is exactly this. So let's ask our audience, do you have the data to be able to form a strategy? So when we say that, an energy strategy. So yes, no, don't know. So be intrigued today. Does the comments resonate? Do you have the data to be able to form an energy strategy? So building on your previous responses to the previous poll, I'll leave that open for a split moment. We'll encourage audience at this point to send questions through. As already said and mentioned a few times from myself, we have got questions through, so please send them through. We will get to your questions as a dedicated questions section on today's webinar. So if we just close the poll, that'd be great. And as you can see, the results are in. So just over half have said yes when it comes to do you have the data to be able to form a strategy. Just over a third say no. And then we have a commonality with the don't knows at the moment, 13% again. So just first reactions, panelists, I guess does that resonate? Does that tie in with some of the earlier comments in terms when it comes to data? I see Ati, you nodding your head. Is it a simple yes?
Yes, I think it does, yes.
Right.
Yeah, but in regards to organisations not having access to data, I mean, I think one thing we haven't touched upon is the challenge with landlord and tenant relationships and how that can be quite painful in terms of trying to get data in terms of performance. So again, it's down to, sub-metering in buildings, etc., which isn't a sticky plaster fix. These projects can take a year and a half to deliver in terms of sub-metering. So yes, I agree.
So before I go on to the next question, I'm going to ask our audience just to get their fingers at the ready, a bit of typing before I go into the next section. I'll be intrigued to know, as this is an open response, so it's not a poll, is who do you feel is responsible for your company's energy strategy? So we've kindly asked you today about your data. We've asked you whether you've got a strategy, but for those that have one and possibly don't have one or don't know, for all our audience really, who do you currently sit there today as you're on this webinar you would truly believe is responsible for your company's energy strategy? So I'd be intrigued just to know your open responses as they come in. Now, yeah, everyone's saying everyone. Some people are saying CEO, COO. Another response on everyone, everyone. Someone said facilities manager, and we've got a poll coming up about that later. Someone said there landlord, so just tied in your point, Atia. So we're capturing that, but I will go into the next question that we will go through this and some of these points. So keep sending your responses in, audience. They're great. As I say, we're getting mixed views there, right from let's go at the top with the CEO and the board, right through to the holistic approach of it being everyone. Whether that's reality or not, I'm not sure, but I'm going to ask the panelists that question in a moment. So I just move on to our question around, we've talked a little bit about the challenges and appreciate time. We could have dedicated a whole webinar to the first two questions, but we've got an hour. How can businesses bridge the gap between these challenges, and what do they need to consider next? So we're going a little bit into the, I guess, the how and what. So I'm going to go to David first. So we talk about the holistic approach, we talk about technology, we talk about transparency. So without giving you some answers, David, in terms of bridging the gap, how can businesses go about that, and what should they be considering next?
Just all those things that you mentioned there, Peter. I think you hit the nail on the head. No, I like I said before, I think, and I know it's not an easy thing for some people to think about, but is to really start to think about what the business looks like in the future. And like Ben said, access to data is an issue for many customers, but for me there's a bit about sitting down and working out what data it is that you actually need to support that plan, to support that decision making process. Again, just to touch on one thing specific, we see a lot of customers, even where that strategy is taking form and is really starting to kind of align to their carbon reduction targets, aligns to their let's say energy risk policy, so managing the cost side of it and the carbon side of it. There still seems to be a slight mismatch in terms of let's say projects being delivered. So people will, like Ben mentioned, often say, well, we are going to be putting in some EV charging points because we've got a very specific requirement for some of our fleet to be able to charge out the business. Or we understand, given the cost of the kind of electricity coming through the meter, that now is a great time to do solar. So let's put some solar on the rooftop and let's put enough on there to cover our peak day usage. I think what we need to start seeing is a much more holistic view of how those technologies will interoperate with that business of the future. So really starting to think about the sizing, the fit, how the technologies will interact, because then you can start to look at that let's say business case, if you want to put it in that terms. How do you assess the business case for the business of the future, rather than looking at each specific technology and saying, no, that simply doesn't stack up, or that does stack up? Because making decisions in isolation at the minute feels very much like you may count the cost of that further down the line.
So yeah, as you touched upon that, David, and I'll bring Ben in, and a little bit unfair, Ben, to a degree, around the point around consider next and the challenges. But I actually used the word, the letters ROI earlier, and a couple of our questions have come into that. So how do you go ensuring that you get that return on investment? I guess that's the silver bullet to a lot of this, and where I guess the skepticism on that long-term as well as short-term opportunity. So if you can address the challenges, next steps, but also the ROI, because it does tie in with a lot of questions we've had in around return on investment.
Yeah, 100%. ROI is a really difficult one, because what you tend to find is that organizations will look at an individual project and they'll only have an ROI on that specific asset. So again, we've spoken about this a couple of times, but it has to link into that holistic view and that wider piece around where does this asset, this project, this financial investment fit in our overall strategy. And it's interesting because it does lead back to a couple of points on that poll around who's responsible for delivering energy strategy, and quite a few responses saying, well, everyone's responsible. And I absolutely agree. When it comes to delivering a strategy, everyone is absolutely responsible. But if you say, right, off you go, everyone, you are now our new head of energy strategy, you'll get everyone pulling in different directions. So you need someone centralizing who can coordinate, who can pull on their existing networks. But again, going back to the points that we've made earlier, that you need someone who has those expertise, who has that upskill set in order to coordinate, to set the targets, to give that direction. So an ROI for a project may well be, what do we want to achieve over the next 5 years across our energy strategy? Looking at what assets do we need on site generation, contracting mechanisms. But the best way to do it is to bring all of those different elements together, rather than say, this specific asset will pay for itself in the next 5 years, tick, let's go for it.
No, great, Ben. And I'm going to do you as a double act now, Sandeep, and at it from the service provider's lens now. And how do you go about bringing that data, technology and strategy together for a long-term business plan? So for those out there struggling with that, what have you seen from your own organization's point of view as well as clients? How do you go about overcoming some of those challenges when it comes to data and technology and strategy in particular? So any wise words for our audience today, how you go about that?
In terms of energy strategy, absolutely right. Agree with everyone that but what needs to happen is you need to create a project steering group. There has to be a steering group which actually has someone from the C-suite, someone from the facilities management team, someone an energy expert, whether in-house or external. And these people need to have a holistic view and drive it. The first and also the most important thing is actually the sequence of events that needs to happen. The first that needs to happen is data collection. And in order to get the right data, you will have to do a gap analysis. You have to do a data audit. If you are looking to be a carbon neutral company, you will be looking at scope 1 and 2 emissions. So you need to understand what's included in scope 1 and 2. If you're going for net zero, then you will have scope 1, 2, and 3. You will have to understand what's included out of all those 15 categories for scope 3. Once you understood what's required, then you will think about like what data needs to be gathered. So that's your step 1. Once you create that baseline is when you actually think about technologies like heat decarbonization. Are your assets on, for example, like boilers? Are these boilers can be replaced with air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps? Or are there other technologies that could be used? For example, there are hydrogen-ready CHPs in the market, which is waiting right now. And as soon as the blend of hydrogen in the energy supply market increases, it will be something to be looked into. So those are that is where you have to engage an energy expert to look at all the multiple technologies and what's suitable for your business.
No, that's great. Thank you, Sandeep. And anything to add on that, Ati, on back of Sandeep's response?
No, I agree with Sandeep. It's all around, that initial benchmarking of your organization. So understanding your energy sources, the locations where you have actual, half-hourly data, or exactly how your billing takes place as well. So is it a landlord-tenant relationship? So yeah, it all comes back down to accurate benchmarking, undertaking exactly what Sandeep said, like your gap analysis as well. But I also like to add as well, it's around making sure that you have a bit of a framework approach to what your program is going to be. So, and there is information out there available. So for example, ISO 50001, the energy management standard, gives you a really good framework for adopting an energy management system, but also in terms of supporting your net zero strategy as well. So it will help you with your management reviews and get your governance structure up and running, get those energy reviews in place. So there is information out there to support organisations.
No, that's great. And I'm going to move on quickly to our next poll, because the next section I want to just touch upon is about behaviours leading to change and actually who's responsible. So we touched upon it a little bit in the open responses, and we had a lot of everyone's CEOs and some FM did come up. But the next poll is, do you believe facilities professionals are instrumental to ensuring decarbonisation within your organisation? So it's a simple yes, no, don't know. So actually looking at the behaviours and those leading the change or being the agents of change, where do you see the role of FM in this? So do you believe facility managements are instrumental to ensuring decarbonisation for your organisation? Just aware of the time, Lucy. So if we just close the poll, there you go. 89% believing yes, 11% saying no, and 0%. Well, there you go. We've got 89% agreeing with that. Does that, I'll go to Sandeep and Atia, obviously from an FM service provider's point of view, it's probably welcoming to see, and this is an IWFM webinar, but from that, do you see FM, and we'll go on to skills in a moment, and that's probably where I'll wrap up before I go to questions, but it's encouraging to see, but what needs to happen for that really to resonate maybe across the built environment beyond within FM? So I guess the issue there is how do we ensure that that's a common answer, whether you were conducting this webinar on another built environment platform, so to speak. So Sandeep, Bhatia, how does those results feel to you in terms of 89% saying it is FM?
No, I think it's encouraging to see that people believe that FM has got a key role in decarbonization. And I absolutely agree, because FM are the people on the ground, are the ones who are implementing those strategies which has been laid out to reach the decarbonization. Also, FM providers, we rely on suppliers to provide those services and goods. So those suppliers, FM providers have a duty to actually source suppliers which are sustainable. And hence the reason why they, when you have a sustainable and ESG governed FM provider, it makes a life a lot easier for the end user in their net zero strategy. So absolutely, we are the ones on the ground to implement it, and we are quite instrumental.
No, thank you. And Atia, would you echo those comments? Again, I've had comments back in from the audience saying absolutely it's FM, yeah. So even stronger views than just a yes.
I 100% agree. I think we are pivotal really in terms of behavioural changes within buildings as well. So we always have, I mean, I could give you a load of examples in my career where I've come across, you know, an infused cleaner or a security guard who are adamant that, you know, this light should be switched off. This needs to have, it's too hot on this floor, we need to change this, you know, someone needs to change the temperature. So yeah, we definitely are instrumental in that. And I'd also like to say that we do have, like, I'm getting a lot more interest over the last few weeks, I would say, with customers wanting us to provide information on our services, energy consumption. So for example, cleaning or engineering, etc. And there's now a big focus on us as well, thinking about, right, customers are now interested in us, like giving them information about assets that aren't plugged into buildings, so battery packet assets, etc., and also assets energy performance as well. So yeah, I think it's a growing area, and it's really exciting for me as well to get more involved in services that traditionally have been overlooked in terms of energy, so security, front of house, and cleaning. So
No, that's great. And David and Ben, to bring you in, and obviously we've had the service provider FM discussion there on the back of the poll, is how can organisations and electricity suppliers such as yourself understand their requirements, and how can these discussions be improved? So I guess anything from a Bryt Energy perspective and how you would hope those discussions be improved as time moves on.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we see is as that energy strategy develops, not being afraid to be transparent with the supplier and vice versa from a supplier perspective, not be afraid to be very open and transparent with a customer. I guess often the way that placing your supply contract has worked, which is obviously one element of your energy strategy, has always been viewed probably as a negotiation, as a much more about the cost element. Whereas obviously moving forward, the supplier could play a huge part in helping unlock that energy strategy. So as we've already talked about there, particularly with the introduction of new technologies, customers really starting to understand their own consumption and future consumption at a granular level, like Ben said. So if we've got a view of what you expect to use, what flexibility you may have there in terms of being able to reduce your consumption, increase your consumption, shift your consumption from various points in the day to other points, particularly if you're being driven by price signals or carbon signals, that starts to be a really interesting discussion between a supplier and a customer about how can we not only help you manage risk, but also start to realize some benefit from what you're able to do on the site. And that is very different. That is a very different environment to just kind of negotiating a price, putting that price to one side for 3 years until the contract comes up for renewal again. This is going to have to be much more of an interactive process between customers and suppliers.
No, thank you, David. And again, do they resonate, Ben, from your perspective, from I guess Bryt Energy and what you would hope to see happen in the future, but the near future, I would guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the word I keep coming across at the moment is authenticity, and that both goes in terms of how you work with your partner companies, but also to do with how you message out internally and externally your approach. There's some things around greenwashing been thrown around over the last couple of years. People aren't there ready to beat you around the head if they believe that your energy strategy isn't exactly what you say it is. As long as the intent is in the right place and you're being really authentic with how you are communicating, it makes a huge difference in terms of setting a culture change as to what you're looking to do. But yeah, when it comes to working sort of customer suppliers, I mentioned it at the very beginning, what I'm doing at the moment a lot of the times is to develop a contract that's appropriate. And that's both appropriate for the consumer, the customer, the client, but also for where the market is at the time. Historically, as David said, it was a negotiation on price as to what level of risk will a supplier take on and at what cost. The movements we've seen from now is that, and as I mentioned, the cost of risk is so much higher, the level of volatility is so much higher that those contracts are now being looked into in a lot more detail, which is great because it then means you can have an open conversation. Are you looking at putting a PPA in over the next 3 years? What form does that PPA take? How will that interact with your energy contract? Again, going back to that piece around coordination, if that's not there, you could end up with a situation where the person who's put the supply contract in place is coming to you in halfway through the contract and saying, oh, by the way, I hope you don't mind, we've put a 5 megawatt CHP on site. That might give a slight change to our consumption patterns. Is that covered under our contract? Actually, thinking there's just so much additional volatility that's been caused. Whereas if you're having an open, honest conversation up front, you then put in the mechanisms that are appropriate for what the business is doing now, what the targets are in the future, that works for both people involved in that contract.
No, yeah, and I think that's something again, as David alluded to, that relationship gets stronger, as well as more tailor-made contracts, which I appreciate you've touched upon, Ben, is part of your day job of how you do that for the clients. Now I'm going to move to questions. There is one more poll around skills, and I want to finish how we started at around skills, and there's a couple of questions in there, but I'll come to the poll next. So if we go to questions slide, no, if we do the poll later, that'd be great. Thank you, Lucy. That's me that's changed it up a little bit. So we have got a questions section. We've had questions in, and some of them, a lot of them resonate with skills. So we'll come on to that in terms of the poll. We've got a question here. We've touched upon technology briefly, admittedly, because of time constraints today on today's webinar. But we've got a question in this. We've seen a demand for solar increase since the cost of living crisis, and there'll be huge supply issues as a result. Does the panel foresee supply issues in solar and wind products and materials to enable sustainability targets to be met? So talking about these market forces, of which one of them is the economy and the cost of living, there's a big emphasis on renewable technology or renewables technology. Does the panel actually see this as an issue in terms of supply? So if we can keep our answers short, is it a yes, no, or don't know, I gather? So
There is a supply issue. There is a supply issue, yes. Agree.
Yes.
Do you foresee that lasting long, Sandeep, or is that a crystal ball question?
No, I believe because of the increasing demand, yes, it will be lasting a little bit longer than what we anticipate, because if you look at roughly, the solar has pretty much gone tenfold.
No, I know that's something to monitor. So generally, the panel's in agreement that there is a problem with that. We've got a question here, and I think it's probably resonates. Is are there any easily quantifiable, low-hanging fruit, quick wins that operational FMs could focus on as starters for 10? Or is it imperative to start with a steering group data collection baseline and strategic energy objectives? So obviously this listener has been listening very well to some of our responses, but where do you start with this? Is there any quick response to that? I know we touched upon it briefly today, but is there anything you should focus on? So Ati, I'll come to you on that. I think this colleague's kindly asking, well, where do you start with this?
Definitely the baseline. So if we start on the end of low-hanging fruit, you tend to go around in a circle and you don't really achieve your objectives. And we have to get that senior leadership buy-in. It has to be key decision makers engaged in the energy program, or it just ends up being a lot of demotivated people and subject matter experts. So definitely the baseline, and then you work your way through to a steering group. That's probably stage 3, I would say.
No, that's great. And David, Ben, does that resonate with your clients? Would you emphasize that emphasis on the baseline?
Yeah, yeah, very much so. Echoing, I know we haven't got a lot of time, very much echoing what Ati just said there. I think that is really, really important.
No, that's great. So as promised, it was always difficult in the hour to get through the questions. We're kindly through. Colin, thank you for your response about FMs have always been not necessarily at the heart of the design stage, and we should actually be conducting that more. I think again that's something we're trying to ensure that we're part of that in terms of FMs being recognised, and I think that was one of the reasons behind our questions of how we can actually make FMs the agent of change and really seen as the agents of change when it comes to net zero and energy strategy moving forward. I want to go to our last poll because we've had a lot of questions through, and as I said, I'll get the questions across to the panelists and they will respond back to you. So we've got a poll here, and it's the last one. You'd be pleased to know is, does your organisation have the appropriate in-house skills and expertise to function specifically in relation to net zero and carbon reduction? So comprehensive in-house skills and expertise, some in-house skills and expertise, no in-house skills and expertise, and don't know. So I'll let you a few moments to respond to that. And then in terms of panelists, I'd just like you to wrap up on the skills of without previewing the results, how we could actually cover the skills debate moving forward. So I'll just give a split moment for this. And then, yeah, if we can close the poll, Lucy, that'd be great. So you've got 62% some in-house skills expertise, 21% saying they're comprehensive, and again, 13% indicating no in-house skills and 4% don't know. Atia, I'm going to come to you because I started with you and you kindly brought up the S word, which on this occasion is skills. How is that? How do we overcome that? How is ISS tackling this within not only your own organisation, but respectively clients? How do you get that skills balance right?
Yeah, it's a big challenge, I would say. But from my personal experience over like the last 10 years or so, I've made sure that we are engaged with universities and other organisations, learning institutes, etc., so that we're tapping into those skills. But also on a personal note, I've been working with the university to ensure that the courses that the students are doing are designed towards industry, because I don't want students with 60K debt finishing university and not being able to walk into a job. So there's that piece. There's a piece around internships, work experience opportunities, and also tapping into different levels of apprenticeships, and working on also getting hard to reach groups into sustainability careers as well. So it is a huge piece going on there.
Thank you, Atia. And how does that resonate in the world of Bryt Energy when it comes to this massive topic of skills? And appreciate we could have had a dedicated webinar purely on skills, and maybe this is a follow-up because the conversation doesn't stop here when it comes to net zero and energy strategy. But Ben, David, does that resonate around skills? Is it an issue around there in terms of your clients?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, we see a lot of clients will use external third parties for some of the things that we work with. We work also with a number of partners who are assisting customers very closely with some of their energy strategy work. Whether it's difficult to understand that chicken and egg situation, whether those third parties are relied on heavily because of the skill shortage within the customer themselves, or whether the customers never brought along those skills because they've always had a third party in place to almost kind of interlock and form part of that energy steering committee, for instance, is not something that we really see behind. But I think going forward, there's going to be a much bigger emphasis on understanding, like we said, the business and the specific sites, which probably mean that in-house skills become a lot more important for customers.
No, thank you, David. Anything to add to that, Ben, as a final close?
Yeah, I just want to briefly say about what we do at Bryt in that area. Atia, similar to yourselves, we have partnerships with local universities. We're not a large company in ourselves. You know, we only have a staff of about 86 odd people in total, but within that, we make sure that we're able to have specific individuals who have at least a broad understanding of where they can go to get that information, and predominantly that is through, you know, education facilities.
No, thank you. And as I've already said, again, there's a number of areas here we've touched the surface on. I would encourage the audience on today's webinar to look at the guidance supported by our partner Bryt, that thought leadership piece at the start of today's episode that delve deeper into today's topics. We've added some extra flavour today. Also within that document, there are some checklists and questions to ask yourselves as well as your own organisation clients around this topic. But as I say, the topic doesn't stop here. It's going to evolve. We're in 2023. So as an institute, the skills, technology, data, the responsibility of FM as the Institute for Workplace and Facilities Management, that's our role to support our profession across this journey. And it is a journey. And I think from today, hopefully you've got nuggets of information to take away. So I want to say a massive thank you, as I see you on my screens in running order. So Atia, thank you. Sandeep and David and Ben, both respectively from Bryt, for your support on today's webinar, as well as the document I referenced. So I know I've slightly gone over time, so I blame the host for that. Oh, that's me. I've just got a couple closing out slides before we close today. We've got a number of members. I appreciate we've got non-members on today's episode. CPD, important tool, that's the number there. Just to remind the audience, this recording will be on the website shortly, so you can take note of this number, as well as more importantly, probably cascade to clients and colleagues that couldn't make today's episode. The Institute is heavily involved in communities in terms of our community group forums. Again, this is where we encourage our members to really build on topics you've heard today, such as net zero and energy strategies, to actually use this as a platform to continue discussions. So please use that. That is a recently new initiative from the Institute. So please encourage our members to use that, because it's only going to be as good for the discussions if you use it without stating the obvious statement of the week. Now, something close to my heart is the Market Outlook survey, which does touch upon energy as a factor. So this is a survey currently in field. It closes Friday, but gives us the opportunity to understand what's happening in the market for the next 12 months, what the barriers and challenges are. It's a pivotal piece of flagship research we do at the Institute. So would encourage you, if you can, to complete as well as cascade to your colleagues and clients within the workplace and FM profession. So please complete that if you can. It's very short survey, it's 10 minutes, but would appreciate that. We've had a good response to date, but would like more as always. Again, we've got our impact awards. These are in 16th of October. So we are looking for entries. As you can see clearly on your screens there, the deadline is the 5th of April. So would encourage people across our sphere and our membership to complete entries, and the deadline is the 5th of April for that. So you'd be pleased to know this is the last slide. I'd want to say a massive thank you to the panel again, Ben, David, Atia and Sandeep, for their contribution today on a topic that could have gone on for another hour, but I appreciate some of you have other things to do, probably your day job. So we do try close this out within the hour. I want to say a massive thank you to Bryt Energy in particular for not only today's webinar, but the document that I referenced earlier, and would encourage once again the audience to have a look at that, because it does have some checklists at the back to encourage you to how you overcome some of those challenges, and where do you actually start, which resonated with some of the questions that came through. Just one last request. There is a short survey that's going to be posted to you after this, not just to rate today's episode, which is important, but what future episodes on the NTT series you would like to see the Institute cover. We've listened, we've acted on that feedback from that survey, and it's really supported the 88 episodes, which this was the 88th episode in terms of our back catalogue as well as our future catalogue. So we'd encourage you to complete that. But lastly, thank you listeners, viewers. As I said earlier, this is my last hosting stint on the NTT, which I will miss. It's been enjoyable to run these since they kicked off in March 2020. They've been a pivotal way of interacting with our audiences, our members and non-members, on really vital initiatives, themes and challenges and opportunities that FMs and workplace professionals are facing at the moment. So the recording will be shortly on the website. A massive thank you again, and the NTT series will be soon up next with its next episode. But thank you again, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.